Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor of ClassicsToday.com, here with a sequel, in fact, a bunch of sequels, to Mozart's Gran Partita, the greatest piece of music ever written for wind ensemble. That is, in partita form. A serenade, a divertimento, a cassation, a nocturne. They're all the same things, but they basically mean a largish piece in several movements for whatever ensemble they're written for. In this case, winds, woodwinds, specifically with some horns thrown in too, which actually, the French horn is half brass, half woodwind. It works with either. That's why it became such an essential part of the orchestra and so many chamber ensembles, because it can sort of blend with everything and also provide beautiful harmonic support while offering fabulous solo opportunities. I mean, that's the horn. It's almost another talk all by itself, isn't it? Anyway, Mozart was the greatest composer who ever existed for wind ensemble, and the Gran Partita is the greatest of those works. He also subsequently wrote a couple of wind octets for pairs of oboes, clarinets, horns, and bassoons, which are equally fabulous and equally important. Now, I did a talk about Mozart's wind music, and because I hate loose ends, I wanted to tidy things up and see where that tradition took us. Because, Mozart was writing within a tradition, the Viennese aristocratic tradition, really, of wind ensemble writing, which arose because most aristocrats had to have their own in-house wind ensemble for use during dinner or parties or hunting or whatever activities they did that you needed music. Having a full orchestra, which necessitated a string section, was very, very expensive. But having, half a dozen to a dozen wind players hanging around, who also did other things, by the way, that's not all they did. They could be domestic servants who also played the oboe. I mean, something like that. That was more feasible economically. Hence, an enormous repertoire, mostly in the 18th and early 19th centuries, of music for wind ensembles, what was called in German Harmonie, Harmonia. The Harmonia ensemble was the ensemble of wind music, and every composer wrote some. Haydn wrote a lot of it. We're going to talk about some of his stuff at some point. Mozart was, of course, the great master. And there was a wonderful tradition coming out of Czechoslovakia. Composers like Kozeluch and Mysliveček and Krummer, they all wrote fabulous and huge quantities of music for wind ensemble because the demand for this stuff was insatiable. And most of it was not published. It was not considered music that needed to survive. It was used for the occasion and then, torn up, or you wrapped your lunch in the manuscript. You did something with it. But a lot of it was not published in the composer's lifetime. It wasn't designed for that. Mozart's music, of course, was so great that it definitely survived, even though Mozart never published it. And there was, after Mozart, really because of Mozart, a tiny echo, an afterthought, if you will, of compositions written in the 19th century, which reflect that once great tradition, which died out really completely after the French Revolution and the revolutions of 1848, and when music making became either a bourgeois domestic activity for the upper class business and non-aristocratic peoples, or simply subsidized by the state. And they no longer had need for this kind of stuff, and it all just went poof and disappeared. So all of the wind music written in the 19th century that I'm going to talk about was concert music, deliberately concert music. It wasn't written for any aristocrat. It was designed to be performed normally in a concert by a wind ensemble that might play, for example, some works by Mozart, which were practically the only items of this repertoire that survived until the 20th century, and we began to revive some of the works by composers who were Mozart's contemporaries. So, What are the great 19th century works for wind ensemble? Well, there are very few. There's like 3, 4. I mean, I know there are more out there, but ones that we care about now, very few. The most famous of them, I gave its own video, and that was Mozart's, not Mozart, we just talked about Mozart, Dvořák's Wind Serenade, Opus 44 in D minor. That is the greatest 19th century work for wind ensemble. Hands down, that's the one. But there are a couple of others that are really beautiful, wonderful works that you really ought to know about. One of them is the Guno Petite Symphony for 9 wind instruments. And you can get it coupled to the Dvořák Wind Serenade, which is really very handy. This is an Orfeo disc. It's with the Münchner Bläser Academy, the Munich Bläser Academy under Alexander Brezina on Orfeo. Now, Guno, as an instrumental music composer, of course, doesn't have much of a reputation. He wrote operas and oratorios and vocal music in the classic French tradition, but his Petite Symphony is a lovely, charming, delicious little work. I want to play you just a few minutes of the finale so you get a sense of it. It's marvelous. It's delicious. It's a lovely, lovely work in the tradition of the Mozart serenades. Here it is. Terrific, right? What's not to love? And you may see it coupled to other things that are also worth having, such as the Dvořák or the Guno symphonies or things like that. You know, it tends to pop up here and there, but maybe hard to find otherwise. But still, it's nice to know that it exists. And you should certainly be looking for it if you enjoy top quality music for wind ensemble. Now, the next piece, which is an incredible rarity, and it was mentioned in the comments by one of you when we were talking about the Dvořák Serenade. And so I appreciate the fact that you mentioned it. And that comment, in fact, sort of inspired this sequel talk, because I did want to mention it because it's really quite wonderful. And that's Joachim Raff's Simponnetta for winds. Now, this is really a 4-movement little symphony. It's about, how long is it, like 26 minutes or so? Yeah, 26 and a half minutes. It's really a fine work. On this disc, it's performed by, and this is its only recording, by the way, that I know about, Andras Joho, and let's see, with the Radio Symphony Orchestra of Basel. Now, it's coupled on this disc with the 11th Symphony, which is the Herbst Symphony, the Winter Symphony. It was part of Raff's 4 Seasons of Symphonies, which I could do another sequel talk to the four seasons, couldn't I? Because there are lots of 4 seasonses. But this one is the Winter Symphony, which in this case is conducted by Mario Fenzago, who was actually not a bad conductor before he became an insane Bruckner person and the most horrible conductor of Bruckner symphonies that ever existed. Well, second most horrible. I think that other guy, Remy Ballet, whatever his name is, on Gramola, he's probably the most horrible Bruckner conductor that ever existed. But there's such competition for that title, and this is not the place to go into it. Anyway, the Simponnetta is very interesting in its scoring because it includes flutes. And flutes are rather rare, actually, in wind music because the flute operates on an entirely different plane of tone from all the other members of the woodwind family, which are basically reed instruments plus horns. But the flute is different. It doesn't blend with anything. It really makes a wonderful solo instrument. That's why, Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven could write big orchestral pieces with only a single flute on top, because it really is a solo instrument, almost no matter what context you stick it into. But Raff, who was a marvelous orchestrator, as we know, he helped Liszt orchestrate his tone poems and things, did a beautiful job integrating the flutes into his ensemble in this absolutely lovely little 4-movement Sinfonietta. And if you haven't heard it, you really should. I'm going to play a little bit of the scherzo, which is a tarantella. It's quite marvelous. Here. Terrific stuff. And this disc on Tudor, as I said, is your only source for it. So if you want to get this piece, you have to get this plus the 11th Symphony, which is really fun to listen to. The problem with the way Tudor has done this is that, they made a big box of all the Raff symphonies, and they include this version of the 11th, but they didn't include the Simponnetta, which is like, what a mistake, because, they included the overtures and suites and all this other stuff that Raff wrote for orchestra, but not the Sinfonietta, which is a shame, because it's a lovely, lovely, lovely work for wind ensemble. However, the major source of wind ensemble music after Mozart was Richard Strauss. And Richard Strauss, I actually have, this is still around. Thank God it's still around. It'll be coming back in a big box. But this is the Netherlands Wind Ensemble. This is on Newton Classics. And you get all the Richard Strauss music for wind ensemble. And there are 4 major works. 4. And 2 are early. And the rest are very, very, very late. And they are really quite extraordinary of their kind. The first is that I'm going to talk about, maybe not necessarily chronological order, is the Serenade Opus 7, which is only 2 minutes and 23 seconds long in this performance. It's just a little slow movement. But the big work of his early period is the Suite in B flat, Opus 4, which has, 4 large movements. It lasts more than 20 minutes. It's quite a serious piece, and it's obviously, recognizably in the style of Mozart's Gran Partita. It's also written for 13 wind instruments, though not the ensemble layout doesn't have to be exactly the same, but it's really, really a lovely, lovely early work of Strauss. However, at the very end of his life, after World War II, when Strauss was basically noodling around his studio, he wrote 2 pieces he called sonatinas for wind instruments. Now, these sonatinas, or little sonatas, are huge. One of them is more than half an hour long. It's called From an Invalid's Workshop. He wrote it after an illness, and he was recovering, and he wanted to do some work, so he returned to the style he loved best, which was that of Mozart, and wrote these 2 works in an obvious Mozartian style. But it's 30-some-odd minutes long. And the second one, after the Invalid's Workshop, came the Happy Workshop. Strauss was happy, 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 happy. He was a happy guy. And the Happy Workshop is 40 minutes long at a minimum. And I have to say, I have been around when these things are performed. They are typical Strauss. That is, lots and lots of notes, busy textures, harmonies that you think sound kind of classical, but don't go quite where you think they're going to. If you know like the string sextet and Capriccio, you'll know the kind of style to expect in these works. But the Happy Workshop, like I said, lasts like 40 minutes, and nothing is more boring than a bad performance of the Happy Workshop. It can be done well, as it is by the Netherlands Wind Ensemble. Thank you, folks, because otherwise you may think that it is the most useless pile of hooey you've ever heard in your life. It is such tough music to play well and make consistently interesting. It's not that Strauss was lacking in inspiration. It's that Strauss could just spin out attractive notes endlessly. And he always had, as this was Strauss, a defective sense of musical timing. he never was quite able to judge when he should stop. And the Happy Workshop, I believe personally, sort of reflects that. But a great performance of it can make every note sound as though it were necessary and intentional. So, I mean, it's wonderful music worth listening to. And if you enjoy the Gran Partita by Mozart, and you have a feel for wind music and wind sonorities in general, and it's the kind of thing that pleases you, then you'll have to have, Strauss's late works, because really they are the last works of a once glorious tradition that persisted only because of Strauss until the 1940s. After that, I mean, other people may have written things, but there are no works by major composers written for this kind of ensemble, for this purpose. That is, to be light and diverting and easy on the ear and mellow and pleasant and enjoyable, and just to give you pure, unalloyed pleasure. And that's exactly what all of these pieces do. So if you're looking for a sequel to the Mozart Gran Partita, that's Panera, the Mozart Gran Panera, where you now have your choice of pizza or soup and a sandwich. Now, the Gran Partita, that's what it's called. If you're looking for a sequel to the Gran Partita, then try the Guno Petite Symphony, the Dvořák Serenade, which any sane person has already heard, or all of the multifarious works composed by Richard Strauss. It's an easy tradition to wrap your brain around and to acquire for your own discography, and it will give you a great deal of pleasure. So keep on listening, folks. Thank you for joining me. All the best.